They saw a petite civilian trying to enter their sacred space. What they didn't see was the jagged scar hidden beneath her tank top, a purple heart scar that would shatter every assumption they'd made about courage, sacrifice, and what a true warrior looks like. The Nevada sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete expanse of Marine Corps Base 29 Palms, creating shimmering heat waves that distorted the desert landscape beyond the perimeter fence. It was 0800 hours on a Tuesday morning in July, and the temperature was already climbing toward what would become a scorching 108-degree day. The kind of heat that made even seasoned Marines grateful for the air-conditioned sanctuary of indoor facilities. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Marine Corps Combat Development Command building stood like a fortress of glass and steel against the brutal desert backdrop. Its imposing facade reflected the morning sun in blinding sheets of light, and its entrance was marked by massive concrete pillars that seemed to dwarf anyone approaching. This wasn't just another military building. It was the intellectual heart of Marine Corps innovation, where the future of warfare was conceived, debated, and refined. Inside the building's main corridor, 5 Marines stood in a loose semicircle near the security checkpoint that led to the classified briefing rooms. They weren't there by accident. Each man represented the cream of the Corps, hand-picked for the Advanced Tactical Innovation Symposium, a week-long gathering of the military's most promising strategic minds. These weren't fresh-faced recruits or even typical infantry Marines. These were the rising stars, the men destined for command positions, the ones who would shape the Corps for the next generation. Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez stood at the center of the group, his muscular frame filling out his desert camouflage uniform with the confidence of a man who had never met a challenge he couldn't overcome. At 29, he was already a legend in reconnaissance circles, having completed 3 combat deployments and earned a Bronze Star for leading a daring rescue mission in Helmand Province. His dark eyes missed nothing, constantly scanning, evaluating, cataloging potential threats with the instinctive warrior's warrior. To his right stood Sergeant James Mitchell, a communications specialist whose baby face belied his razor-sharp intellect and uncanny ability to coordinate complex operations across multiple theaters. Despite being only 26, Mitchell had already been fast-tracked through the ranks after developing innovative battlefield communication protocols that had saved dozens of lives during urban combat operations in Syria. Corporal Tyler Brennan, the youngest of the group at 24, more than made up for his age with raw physical presence. Standing 6'4" with shoulders that strained against his uniform, Brennan was a machine gunner who had earned his reputation carrying a 240 Bravo through some of the most hostile terrain in Afghanistan. His pale blue eyes held the steady gaze of a man who had stared down death and emerged victorious. The 4th Marine, Lance Corporal Devin Carter, possessed the wiry build and quick reflexes of a natural-born scout sniper. His dark skin bore the subtle tan lines of countless hours spent motionless in desert camouflage, and his hands, steady enough to place a bullet through a quarter at 800 meters, drummed a nervous rhythm against his thigh. Carter had the distinction of holding the longest confirmed kill shot in his battalion's history, a feat that had earned him both respect and the kind of reputation that preceded him wherever he went. Finally, there was Private First Class Ryan Sullivan, the sole representative of the enlisted ranks among this gathering. At 22, Sullivan had already proven himself as an explosive ordnance disposal specialist, defusing over 40 improvised explosive devices during his deployment to Iraq. His red hair was regulation short, and his freckled face bore the concentrated expression of someone accustomed to working with materials that could vaporize him at the slightest mistake. They had arrived early for the symposium's opening session, partly out of military punctuality and partly out of curiosity about who else would be attending. The invitation list had been highly classified, and each Marine had been personally selected by his commanding officer based on demonstrated tactical innovation and leadership potential. They knew they were among the best, and the knowledge created a subtle but unmistakable air of competitive confidence. The conversation had naturally drifted to speculation about their fellow attendees. Would there be Navy SEALs, Delta Force operators, Air Force Special Tactics personnel? Each service branch guarded its innovations jealously, and the opportunity to observe and learn from other elite units was both exciting and strategically valuable. "I heard there might be some CIA paramilitary officers," Mitchell was saying, his voice lowered despite the security clearances they all held. "The kind who officially don't exist but somehow end up in every major operation." Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "Makes sense. This isn't your typical professional development course. When they classify the attendee list and require this level of security clearance, it means we're dealing with the real deal." The Marines had positioned themselves with unconscious tactical awareness, each man maintaining clear sight lines to all approaches while appearing to engage in casual conversation. It was second nature, the kind of situational awareness that had kept them alive in places where complacency meant death. That's when they saw her. She appeared at the main entrance like a mirage materializing from the desert heat. At first, she seemed almost impossibly out of place, a slight figure in civilian clothes moving purposefully toward the security checkpoint. She wore a simple black tank top that revealed toned but slender arms, dark jeans that fit her petite frame without being tight, and worn leather boots that suggested someone accustomed to practical footwear rather than fashion statements. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a functional ponytail that swayed slightly as she walked, and she carried a small olive-green backpack that looked military in origin but bore no unit markings or insignia. There was something about her posture, straight-backed and confident, that suggested military training, but she was clearly civilian. No uniform, no visible rank, no obvious reason to be approaching one of the most secure buildings on the base. Brennan was the first to notice her, his machine gunner's instincts automatically cataloging potential threats and anomalies. He nudged Carter with his elbow, a subtle gesture that immediately drew the attention of the other Marines. Within seconds, all 5 men were watching the woman's approach with the focused intensity of predators assessing unfamiliar prey. "Who's the civilian?" Sullivan asked quietly, his explosive ordnance disposal background making him naturally suspicious of anything that didn't fit expected patterns. Rodriguez's eyes narrowed as he studied the woman's approach. Something about her movement suggested purpose rather than confusion, confidence rather than uncertainty. She wasn't lost, wasn't hesitating, and wasn't displaying any of the typical behaviors of someone who had accidentally wandered into a restricted area. "Maybe she's support staff," Carter suggested, though his tone indicated he didn't believe his own words. "Cafeteria worker or something." Mitchell shook his head. "Not dressed like support staff, and she's heading straight for the classified briefing checkpoint." The woman continued her approach, seemingly oblivious to the 5 sets of eyes tracking her every movement. There was something almost ethereal about her in the harsh desert light. She seemed too small, too delicate, too civilian to belong in this world of concrete and steel and military precision. Yet she moved with unmistakable confidence, her stride neither hurried nor hesitant. As she drew closer, more details became visible. She appeared to be in her early 30s, with the kind of understated attractiveness that suggested someone who had never needed to rely on physical appearance to command attention. Her face was composed, almost serene, with intelligent hazel eyes that seemed to take in everything without making direct eye contact with any of the Marines. Most striking was her size. She couldn't have stood more than 5'4", and her build suggested someone who stayed fit through running or yoga rather than military physical training. Next to the imposing physical presence of the 5 Marines, she looked almost childlike, a sparrow approaching a gathering of hawks. "There's no way she has clearance for this building," Rodriguez said with growing certainty. "Look at her. She weighs maybe 110 pounds soaking wet. What's she going to contribute to a tactical innovation symposium?" The assumption hung in the air like the desert heat, visible, oppressive, and seemingly inescapable. Here was someone who clearly didn't belong in their world, someone who had obviously made a mistake or taken a wrong turn. The disconnect between her civilian appearance and the building she was approaching was so jarring that it never occurred to any of them that appearances might be deceiving. Brennan crossed his arms over his massive chest, his physical presence alone enough to intimidate most people. Should we say something? Stop her before she gets to security and embarrass herself? The question revealed the fundamental assumption they had all made. This wasn't a case of challenging someone's credentials or questioning legitimate access. This was a case of protecting someone from their own obvious mistake, of preventing an embarrassing encounter with security personnel who would undoubtedly turn her away. It was the kind of casual chivalry that seemed natural to Marines, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, preventing unnecessary confrontation, maintaining order through strength and presence. They saw themselves as the guardians of this space, the rightful occupants who understood its importance and significance. The woman was now less than 50 feet away, close enough that they could see the determined set of her jaw, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the complete absence of uncertainty in her movement. She was heading directly for them, or rather, directly for the checkpoint they were inadvertently guarding through their positioning. "Definitely not military," Sullivan observed, his young eyes taking in details the others might have missed. "Look at her hands. No calluses from weapons training. No tan lines from wearing gear. She's a pure civilian." Carter nodded in agreement. Probably someone's wife or girlfriend who got confused about where to meet them. Happens all the time near the main gate. The assessment seemed reasonable, even charitable. They weren't being malicious or deliberately obstructive. They were simply applying their professional judgment to an obviously anomalous situation. In their experience, people who belong in classified military facilities look and act a certain way. They carried themselves with the bearing of those accustomed to authority, displayed the physical markers of military training, wore the subtle indicators of rank and position. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This woman displayed none of those markers. She was an obvious civilian who had somehow found her way to the wrong place at the wrong time. The logical, even compassionate response was to redirect her before she encountered the harsh reality of military security protocols. Rodriguez made the decision that would define the next several minutes. He stepped forward, positioning himself directly in the woman's path, his 4 fellow Marines automatically falling into flanking positions. It wasn't aggressive, it was professional, controlled, the kind of human barrier that military personnel used to redirect civilian traffic without causing alarm or confrontation. "Excuse me, miss," Rodriguez called out, his voice carrying the authoritative but polite tone of someone accustomed to command. "I think you might be in the wrong place." The woman stopped walking, her boots creating a small scuff of dust on the concrete as she came to a complete halt about 10 feet from Rodriguez. For a moment, she simply stood there, her hazel eyes moving from one Marine to another with the kind of methodical assessment that suggested she was cataloging rather than intimidating. There was no visible irritation in her expression, no sign of surprise or confusion. Instead, she displayed the kind of calm patience that might be expected from someone accustomed to dealing with obstacles. "Good morning," she replied, her voice carrying a slight rasp that spoke of years spent projecting authority in noisy environments. "I'm exactly where I need to be." The response caught Rodriguez off guard. He had expected confusion, perhaps embarrassment, maybe even gratitude for their intervention. Instead, he was facing someone who seemed completely unperturbed by the wall of military muscle blocking her path. Her tone wasn't defiant or confrontational, it was simply matter-of-fact, as if she were stating an obvious truth that somehow the Marines had missed. Rodriguez exchanged a quick glance with Mitchell, who raised an eyebrow in an expression that clearly said, "This is interesting." The woman's confidence was either the result of genuine authority or spectacular delusion, and neither option fit their initial assessment of the situation. "Ma'am," Rodriguez continued, his tone remaining professional but taking on a slightly more formal edge, This is a restricted facility. The briefing rooms beyond this checkpoint require Alpha-level security clearance and specific authorization. I'm not trying to give you a hard time, but I think someone might have given you incorrect directions." The woman tilted her head slightly, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both curiosity and mild amusement. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, isn't it?" she said, reading his rank insignia with practiced ease. "I appreciate your concern, but I can assure you that my presence here has been specifically requested." The use of his rank sent a small shock through Rodriguez's system. Civilians didn't typically read military rank structures with such casual accuracy, and her tone suggested familiarity with military protocol rather than nervous guessing. Still, the fundamental disconnect remained. Nothing about her appearance or demeanor suggested someone who belonged in a classified tactical innovation symposium. Brennan stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the woman despite the overhead sun. At 6'4" and 240 pounds of solid muscle, he was accustomed to using his physical presence to end conversations before they became confrontations. Most people, regardless of their official authority, tended to reconsider their positions when faced with a human wall of Marine Corps muscle. "Look, lady," Brennan said, his voice carrying the kind of rumbling bass that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep in his chest. "We're not trying to be difficult here, but this isn't the visitors center, and it's definitely not the place for civilians. The security checkpoint behind us leads to classified briefing rooms where some pretty serious people are about to discuss some pretty serious topics." The woman's gaze shifted to Brennan, and something flickered in her eyes. Not intimidation, but what might have been recognition. It was as if she had encountered his type before, in circumstances that had taught her how to read the difference between genuine threat and theatrical posturing. "Corporal Brennan," she replied, once again demonstrating her ability to read rank insignia. "I understand the classification level of this facility. I also understand that today's symposium is focused on innovations in battlefield medicine, tactical casualty care, and integrated combat support systems." The specificity of her knowledge hit the Marines like a physical blow. The symposium's agenda was classified, distributed only to confirmed attendees and their immediate command structure. The woman wasn't just randomly knowledgeable about military protocol, she was demonstrating access to information that should have been restricted to a very small circle of authorized personnel. Carter, whose sniper training had taught him to notice details others missed, stepped closer to examine the woman more carefully. There was something about her posture that nagged at him, something that didn't quite fit the civilian profile they had all accepted. Her stance was too balanced, too controlled. Her breathing was too steady for someone facing down 5 hostile Marines. And her eyes? Her eyes held the kind of thousand-yard stare that he recognized from his own reflection after particularly difficult missions. "How do you know about the symposium agenda?" Carter asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. The woman's expression didn't change, but something subtle shifted in her body language. It was as if Carter's question had moved the conversation from pleasantries into more serious territory, and she was unconsciously adjusting her mental posture to match. "Because," she said slowly, "I'm one of the keynote presenters." The statement hung in the air like a challenge thrown down before medieval knights. It was so audacious, so completely at odds with every visual cue they were processing, that for a moment none of the Marines knew how to respond. The idea that this petite civilian woman might be a keynote presenter at a symposium designed for the military's most innovative tactical minds was like claiming that a sparrow was secretly an eagle. Sullivan, whose youth made him slightly less constrained by military diplomacy, let out a short laugh that was more disbelief than amusement. "Right," he said, shaking his head, "and I'm the Commandant of the Marine Corps." The woman's gaze shifted to Sullivan, and for the first time, her expression showed something that might have been disappointment. "Private First Class Sullivan," she said quietly, "I would suggest that you reserve judgment until you have more information." Mitchell, whose communications background had taught him to read between the lines of difficult conversations, sensed that the situation was becoming more complex than a simple case of misdirection. The woman's knowledge was too specific, her confidence too unshakable, and her familiarity with military protocol too practiced to be easily dismissed. "Ma'am," Mitchell said, his tone more diplomatic than his colleagues, "perhaps we could see some identification. If you're really supposed to be here, you'll have the appropriate credentials." The request was reasonable, the kind of solution that should have resolved the situation quickly and definitively. Either she would produce legitimate credentials that proved her authority, or she would be revealed as someone who had somehow acquired classified information without proper authorization. The woman reached into her backpack, her movements slow and deliberate in the way of someone accustomed to being watched by armed professionals. She withdrew a military identification card and a set of orders, both bearing official seals and signatures that appeared genuine even at a distance. Rodriguez accepted the documents and examined them carefully, his expression growing increasingly puzzled as he read. The identification listed her as Dr. Sarah Catherine Bennett, with a designation he didn't recognize: Medical Corps Reserve Special Operations Command. The orders were signed by a Colonel Patricia Hayes, directing Dr. Bennett to report for temporary duty at the Advanced Tactical Innovation Symposium as a subject matter expert in combat trauma surgery. "Reserve," Rodriguez said, looking up from the documents with confusion rather than suspicion. "You're military?" "Was," Dr. Bennett replied simply. "Medical Corps Reserve, currently in active status. I completed my active duty obligation 3 years ago." The revelation shifted the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Reserve status explained her civilian clothes and apparent unfamiliarity with current base protocols, but it also raised new questions about why someone on inactive reserve status would be called to participate in a high-classification symposium. Brennan frowned, his mental image of the situation refusing to align with this new information. "What's your specialty?" he asked. "If you're in the medical corps, what makes you qualified to advise on tactical innovations?" Dr. Bennett's expression became carefully neutral, the kind of professional mask that medical personnel learn to wear when discussing difficult topics. "Trauma surgery," she said, "specifically damage control procedures in austere environments." Carter's sniper-trained eyes caught something in her tone, a subtle flatness that suggested painful experience rather than academic knowledge. There was a weight to her words that spoke of first-hand familiarity with the kind of trauma that occurred in combat zones. "Academic experience?" Mitchell pressed. "Teaching hospital rotations?" "Field experience," Dr. Bennett replied, and this time there was no mistaking the edge in her voice. 18 months deployed with Special Operations Command, forward surgical teams supporting direct action missions. The Marines exchanged glances, each processing this new information through the filter of their own combat experience. Forward surgical teams were the medical equivalent of special operations, small, highly trained units that operate in hostile territory to provide immediate trauma care to wounded operators who couldn't be evacuated to conventional medical facilities. Sullivan, chastened by his earlier comment, spoke more carefully. "Where were you deployed?" "Afghanistan," Dr. Bennett said, "primarily Helmand and Kandahar provinces, some operations in Kunar." The geographic specificity hit the Marines like a series of physical blows. These weren't random province names pulled from a Wikipedia article. These were the places where the most intense fighting had occurred, where American forces had faced the highest casualty rates, where survival often depended on the kind of immediate medical intervention that forward surgical teams provided. Rodriguez's mental image of Dr. Bennett began to shift, like a photograph slowly coming into focus. The slight build he had dismissed as civilian softness might actually be the wiry toughness of someone who had carried medical gear through hostile territory. The steady confidence he had interpreted as delusion might be the unshakable calm of someone who had performed life-saving surgery while under enemy fire. "What unit?" Brennan asked, his tone now carrying respect rather than skepticism. "Task Force Ranger," Dr. Bennett replied. "Medical augmentation for direct action operations." The unit designation hit the Marines like a thunderbolt. Task Force Ranger was legendary in special operations circles, a joint unit composed of the military's most elite operators, supported by equally elite specialist personnel. Assignment to Task Force Ranger wasn't given to academic medical officers or reserve personnel looking for deployment credit. It was reserved for individuals who had proven themselves capable of operating at the highest levels of military performance. Carter, whose special operations background gave him familiarity with Task Force's reputation, stared at Dr. Bennett with new understanding. "You were embedded with Rangers?" "Among others," Dr. Bennett said simply. "The Medical Augmentation Program rotated surgical teams through all the special operations units as operational requirements dictated." Mitchell's communications experience told him to probe deeper into the specifics that would either validate or expose Dr. Bennett's claims. "What was your call sign?" "Lifeline," Dr. Bennett replied without hesitation. "Lifeline 6 when I was team leader." The immediate response, combined with her use of proper military call sign protocols, provided another piece of evidence supporting her credibility. But Rodriguez found himself struggling with a fundamental disconnect. The woman standing before them looked like she belonged in a university lecture hall or a civilian hospital, not in the mud and blood of special operations combat zones. "I have to ask," Rodriguez said, his tone now more curious than skeptical. "How does someone your size handle the physical demands of special operations deployment?" It was a reasonable question, asked without malice, but reflecting the genuine puzzlement that all 5 Marines were experiencing. Dr. Bennett couldn't weigh more than 115 pounds, and her build suggested endurance training rather than the kind of load-bearing strength that combat operations typically required. Dr. Bennett's expression remained neutral, but something shifted in her posture, a subtle straightening that seemed to add inches to her height and presence to her bearing. "The same way anyone handles them, Staff Sergeant. You adapt, you endure, and you complete the mission." Brennan shook his head slowly. "No offense, Doc, but special operations teams don't typically carry passengers. If you were deployed with Rangers, you had to be pulling your own weight." "More than my own weight," Dr. Bennett replied, and for the first time there was steel in her voice. "Medical personnel in special operations don't have the luxury of being protected assets. We carry full combat loads, participate in mission planning, and, when necessary, we fight." Sullivan's explosive ordnance disposal background had taught him to respect the kind of technical expertise that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "What kind of procedures were you performing?" he asked. Dr. Bennett's gaze became distant, as if she were looking through the present moment into memories that existed in a different place and time. "Damage control surgery," she said quietly. "Emergency thoracotomies, vascular repairs, limb salvage procedures. Whatever was necessary to keep operators alive long enough to reach definitive medical care." The clinical terminology couldn't disguise the brutal reality of what she was describing. The Marines understood, perhaps better than most civilians, the kind of traumatic injuries that occurred in special operations combat zones. The idea that this slight woman had performed life-saving surgery on critically wounded operators, possibly while under fire, was beginning to reshape their entire understanding of who they were dealing with. Carter's tactical mind began connecting pieces of information that he had initially dismissed as irrelevant. "The backpack," he said suddenly. "It's a military issue." Dr. Bennett glanced down at the olive green pack she carried, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Good eye, Corporal. It's actually from my deployment gear, old habits." "And the boots," Mitchell added, his communications training having taught him to notice details. "Those aren't civilian hiking boots." "Combat boots," Dr. Bennett confirmed. "Broken in during deployment. Most comfortable footwear I've ever owned." Rodriguez found himself re-examining every assumption he had made about Dr. Bennett's appearance and demeanor. The details that had seemed to confirm her civilian status, the practical clothing, the confident movement, the unshakable calm, were actually consistent with someone who had extensive military experience but was no longer bound by uniform regulations. "Why didn't you just say you were former military?" Brennan asked. "Would have saved us all some time."
Dr. Bennett's expression became thoughtful, as if she were considering how to explain something in simple terms. "Because my military experience isn't what qualifies me to be here," she said finally. "My medical expertise is what qualifies me to be here. The military experience just informs how I apply that expertise." The distinction was subtle but important. She wasn't claiming authority based on rank or combat experience. She was claiming authority based on specialized knowledge that had been refined and proven in the most demanding circumstances imaginable.
Sullivan, still processing the revelation of Dr. Bennett's background, voiced the question that all 5 Marines were thinking. So, what exactly are you going to be presenting at this symposium? Dr. Bennett's smile became more pronounced, carrying a hint of anticipation that suggested she was looking forward to share her expertise. "Innovations in field trauma care," she said. "Specifically, techniques for performing complex surgical procedures in non-sterile environments with minimal equipment and maximum time pressure." The description sent a chill through the group of Marines. They had all been in situations where immediate medical care had meant the difference between life and death, and they understood the incredible skill and courage required to perform surgery under combat conditions. Rodriguez slowly handed Dr. Bennett's identification and orders back to her, his expression reflecting a mixture of respect and embarrassment. "Dr. Bennett," he said formally, "I apologize for the confusion. We should have—" "Staff Sergeant," Dr. Bennett interrupted gently, "you were doing your job. Security consciousness is exactly what I'd expect from Marines of your caliber." The gracious response somehow made their initial assumptions feel even more inappropriate. Here was someone who had earned her place in the most elite circles of military medicine, and they had treated her like a lost civilian who needed to be redirected to the visitor center. The security checkpoint behind them buzzed with activity as other symposium attendees began arriving. A Navy SEAL commander strode past, nodding respectfully to Dr. Bennett as if he recognized her, followed by 2 Air Force pararescue specialists who offered brief salutes. The Marines watched this interaction with growing awareness that they had seriously misjudged the situation. But Rodriguez wasn't quite ready to abandon his skepticism entirely. "Dr. Bennett," Rodriguez said, his tone more respectful but still carrying an edge of challenge, "I have to be honest with you. What you're describing, performing surgery in combat zones, it's not exactly what most people think of when they hear Medical Corps Reserve." Dr. Bennett shifted her backpack to her other shoulder, a movement that caused her tank top to pull slightly, revealing what might have been the edge of a scar along her shoulder blade. The glimpse was so brief that none of the Marines were certain they had actually seen anything, but it planted a seed of curiosity that would soon grow into something much larger. "Most reserve medical personnel serve in support roles," she acknowledged. "Garrison hospitals, training facilities, administrative positions. I requested a combat assignment." "Requested?" Mitchell's eyebrows rose. Most people try to avoid combat deployments, especially medical personnel who have civilian practice options. Dr. Bennett was quiet for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the desert horizon visible through the building's glass walls. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested personal obligation rather than professional experience. "I became a surgeon to save lives," she said simply. "The place where that skill was most needed was downrange, not in a stateside hospital treating routine cases." Carter, whose sniper training had taught him to read people as carefully as he read terrain, noticed something in Dr. Bennett's expression, a flicker of something deeper than professional dedication. It was the look of someone who had personal reasons for seeking out danger, reasons that went beyond career advancement or patriotic duty. "What kind of civilian practice did you give up?" Sullivan asked, his young curiosity overriding military diplomacy. "Pediatric trauma surgery," Dr. Bennett replied. "Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. I was the youngest department head in the hospital's history." The revelation hit the Marines like a series of physical blows. Pediatric trauma surgery was widely regarded as one of the most demanding and emotionally difficult specialties in medicine. The fact that she had achieved department head status at a major children's hospital before the age of 30 suggested exceptional skill and dedication.
The fact that she had voluntarily left that position to deploy with Special Operations Forces suggested motivations that went far beyond normal career considerations. Brennan struggled to reconcile this new information with his mental image of military medical personnel. So, you gave up a department head position at a major hospital to carry a rifle through Afghanistan. I gave up a comfortable position to go where my skills could have the greatest impact, Dr. Bennett corrected. And I never carried a rifle. Medical personnel are non-combatants under the Geneva Convention. But you said you fought when necessary, Rodriguez pointed out, remembering her earlier comment. Dr. Bennett's expression became carefully neutral, the kind of professional mask that suggested she was approaching classified or sensitive information. The Geneva Convention protects medical personnel from being targeted, but it doesn't prevent them from defending themselves or their patients when attacked. Mitchell's communications background had given him familiarity with the complex legal and ethical issues surrounding medical personnel in combat zones. Self-defense versus combat operations, that's a pretty fine line in special operations.
It is, Dr. Bennett agreed, which is why medical personnel attached to special operations units receive additional training beyond standard combat medical courses. Carter's tactical mind began working through the implications of what she was describing. What kind of additional training? Dr. Bennett glanced around the corridor, noting the other military personnel moving past them toward the briefing rooms. Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside. I believe the opening session is scheduled to begin shortly. It was a diplomatic way of ending the interrogation, but Rodriguez wasn't quite ready to let her off the hook. Something about her story bothered him, not because he doubted her credentials, but because the pieces didn't quite fit together in the way he expected. Exceptional civilian surgeons didn't typically volunteer for the most dangerous military assignments, and reserve medical personnel weren't usually selected for elite special operations units. One more question, Rodriguez said, holding up a hand to prevent Dr. Bennett from moving toward the checkpoint. What made you qualified for the Task Force Ranger assignment? They don't take people based on civilian credentials alone. Dr. Bennett stopped walking and turned back to face the 5 Marines. For the first time since the conversation began, she looked directly into Rodriguez's eyes with the kind of steady gaze that suggested she was making a decision about how much truth to reveal. Combat experience, she said quietly. From your deployment with Task Force Ranger? Brennan asked. Before my deployment with Task Force Ranger, Dr. Bennett replied. I had already completed 2 previous deployments with conventional forces before being selected for Special Operations assignment. The revelation sent another shock through the group. 3 combat deployments was exceptional for any military personnel, but it was almost unheard of for reserve medical officers who had civilian practice obligations. Most reserve personnel served single deployments, often in support roles that kept them away from direct combat. Sullivan's explosive ordnance disposal experience had taught him that the most dangerous situations often involved the most experienced personnel, people who volunteered for repeated deployments because they possessed skills that couldn't be easily replaced. What happened during those first 2 deployments? Dr. Bennett's expression became distant again, as if she were looking through the present moment into memories that existed in a different time and place. I learned that textbook trauma surgery and combat trauma surgery are completely different disciplines. How so? Mitchell asked, genuinely curious about the technical aspects of her specialty. Textbook trauma surgery assumes sterile environments, unlimited supplies, stable patient condition, and time to properly assess injuries, Dr. Bennett explained. Combat trauma surgery assumes none of those things. You work in dirty conditions with limited supplies on patients who are actively dying while someone is trying to kill you. The clinical description couldn't hide the brutal reality of what she was describing. The Marines understood, perhaps better than most people, the chaos and terror of combat zones. The idea that anyone could perform complex surgery under those conditions was almost incomprehensible. "And you volunteered for that?" Carter asked, his voice reflecting genuine admiration mixed with disbelief. Dr. Bennett was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that suggested painful personal experience. "I had my reasons.
Rodriguez's interrogation instincts told him that they had reached the edge of something significant, a piece of Dr. Bennett's story that explained her unusual career choices and exceptional qualifications. But before he could probe deeper, they were interrupted by a new voice. "Dr. Bennett, there you are." A Marine colonel approached from the direction of the briefing rooms, his uniform bearing the kind of ribbon stack that indicated extensive combat experience and high-level command positions. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in demanding assignments. Dr. Bennett replied, her voice taking on a more formal tone. "Good to see you again, sir." "Likewise," Colonel Morrison said, extending his hand for a brief professional handshake. "I was hoping to catch you before the opening session. There have been some changes to the agenda that I wanted to discuss." "Changes?" Dr. Bennett asked.
Nothing major, Colonel Morrison assured her. We've moved your presentation to the afternoon session and extended your time slot. There's been significant interest in your work on field trauma protocols, and we want to give you adequate time to cover the technical details. Dr. Bennett nodded. That's fine. Will there be time for questions and discussion? Absolutely, Colonel Morrison replied. In fact, we're hoping for extended discussion. Your innovations have potential applications across all the services, not just special operations. Rodriguez found himself reassessing Dr. Bennett once again. The colonel's obvious respect and the reference to her innovations suggested that she wasn't just another subject matter expert invited to share academic knowledge. She was apparently a recognized leader in her field, someone whose work was influencing military medical practices at the highest levels. Colonel Morrison, Rodriguez interjected, I'm Staff Sergeant Rodriguez. My team and I were just speaking with Dr. Bennett about her background. Colonel Morrison's gaze shifted to the 5 Marines, taking in their ranks and unit insignia with the practiced eye of an experienced officer. Ah, you're the reconnaissance specialists from 2nd Marine Division. I reviewed your symposium applications. Impressive operational records. Thank you, sir, Rodriguez replied, pleased that the colonel was familiar with their backgrounds. We were curious about Dr. Bennett's qualifications for this symposium. Colonel Morrison's expression became more serious, and he glanced at Dr. Bennett as if seeking permission to share classified information. Dr. Bennett's work has saved more special operations personnel than any other medical innovation of the last decade, he said finally. Her field trauma protocols have been adopted by every branch of the military and several allied nations. Brennan found himself struggling to reconcile the colonel's description with the petite woman standing before them. Sir, what exactly did she develop? Techniques for performing damage control surgery in austere environments, Colonel Morrison replied. Procedures that allow field medics to stabilize critically wounded personnel when evacuation to surgical facilities isn't possible. Mitchell's communications background gave him familiarity with the medical challenges faced by units operating in remote locations. How is that different from standard field medicine? Dr. Bennett answered before the colonel could respond. Standard field medicine focuses on stabilization and evacuation. My protocols focus on definitive surgical intervention in the field when evacuation isn't an option. Battlefield surgery, Carter said, beginning to understand the significance of what she had developed. Exactly, Colonel Morrison confirmed. Dr. Bennett developed techniques that allow specially trained medics to perform procedures that previously required a full surgical suite. She's personally trained hundreds of special operations medics in these protocols. Sullivan's young mind worked through the implications of what the colonel was describing. She's been teaching other people to do surgery in combat zones? Among other things, Colonel Morrison replied, but her most significant contribution was proving that the techniques actually work under combat conditions. Rodriguez felt a chill run down his spine as he began to understand what the colonel was implying. Sir, are you saying she tested these techniques in actual combat? Colonel Morrison's expression became carefully neutral, and he glanced at Dr. Bennett again. Dr. Bennett's deployment record speaks for itself, he said diplomatically. Dr. Bennett's voice was quiet but clear. I developed the protocols based on necessity during my first 2 deployments. Task Force Ranger provided the opportunity to refine them and train others.
The conversation had taken on a surreal quality for the five Marines. They were beginning to understand that the woman they had initially dismissed as a misplaced civilian was actually a pioneering figure in military medicine, someone whose innovations were being discussed and implemented at the highest levels of military planning. "Dr. Bennett," Brennan said, his voice carrying new respect, "I have to ask, what made you think you could develop new surgical techniques for combat use?" Dr. Bennett's expression became distant again, and she was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Necessity," she said finally. "When conventional techniques aren't adequate to save lives, you either develop new techniques or watch people die." The stark simplicity of her answer hit the Marines like a physical blow. They understood the brutal calculus of combat decision-making, the way extreme circumstances forced innovations that would never be considered in peacetime conditions. Colonel Morrison checked his watch and frowned. "Dr. Bennett, we should probably head to the briefing room. The opening session is scheduled to begin in 10 minutes. "Of course," Dr. Bennett replied, shouldering her backpack and turning toward the security checkpoint.
Rodriguez found himself reluctant to end the conversation, partly because his curiosity hadn't been fully satisfied, and partly because he was beginning to suspect that there were aspects of Dr. Bennett's story that hadn't been revealed. "Dr. Bennett," he called out as she began walking away. She turned back, her expression patient but clearly indicating that she was ready to move on to the business of the symposium. "Thank you for the conversation," Rodriguez said, realizing that he didn't have a specific question to ask. "It's been educational." Dr. Bennett smiled, and for the first time, the expression seemed completely genuine and unguarded. "Staff Sergeant, the education hasn't even begun yet. Wait until you see the afternoon presentation." As she walked toward the security checkpoint with Colonel Morrison, the five Marines stood in silence, each processing what they had learned about the woman they had so confidently intercepted. The conversation had revealed layers of experience and expertise that completely contradicted their initial assumptions, but Rodriguez couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of Dr. Bennett's story. "Well," Sullivan said finally, "I feel like an idiot." "Join the club," Brennan muttered, shaking his head in disbelief. Carter was still studying Dr. Bennett's retreating figure, his sniper-trained eyes noting details that he had missed during their conversation. "Did anyone else notice the scar on her shoulder blade?" "What scar?" Mitchell asked. "When she shifted her backpack," Carter explained, "her tank top pulled tight for a second, and I could swear I saw the edge of a scar along her shoulder blade." Rodriguez frowned, trying to recall the moment Carter was describing. "You sure?" "Not completely," Carter admitted, "but it looked like surgical scarring, the kind that comes from trauma, not elective surgery." The observation added another piece to the puzzle of Dr. Bennett's background, but it also raised new questions about the experiences that had shaped her unusual career path. As the five Marines finally made their way toward the security checkpoint, each was wondering what other secrets the afternoon presentation might reveal. The main briefing room of the Combat Development Command was a technological marvel, equipped with holographic displays, interactive tactical screens, and seating for 200 of the military's most innovative minds. By 1400 hours, every seat was occupied by officers, senior enlisted personnel, and civilian contractors representing every branch of the armed services and several allied nations. The five Marines had managed to secure seats in the third row, close enough to observe Dr. Bennett's presentation in detail, but far enough back to avoid drawing attention to themselves. The morning sessions had been impressive, presentations on advanced weaponry, next-generation communication systems, and revolutionary tactical concepts that would shape warfare for decades to come. But none of the previous presentations had generated the kind of anticipatory buzz that surrounded Dr. Bennett's afternoon session. Rodriguez scanned the audience, noting the concentration of medical personnel, special operations officers, and senior commanders. This wasn't the typical mixed crowd that attended general military symposiums. This was a gathering of people who understood the life-and-death implications of battlefield medical innovations. "Look at the rank in this room," Mitchell whispered, indicating the rows of eagles, stars, and international insignia visible throughout the audience.
Half the Pentagon must be here. Brennan nodded toward a section of seats reserved for international observers. That's the British SAS medical director, and I think that's the German KSK Surgeon General. This isn't just an American presentation. The lights dimmed, and Colonel Morrison approached the podium, his bearing reflecting the significance of the presentation he was about to introduce. The room fell silent, with the kind of immediate attention rather than polite obligation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Colonel Morrison began, his voice carrying clearly through the advanced sound system, "this afternoon's presentation represents a paradigm shift in battlefield medicine. Over the past 5 years, our presenter has developed and field-tested innovations that have fundamentally changed how we approach trauma care in combat environments." Carter leaned forward in his seat, his sniper training having taught him to focus intensely on targets of interest. Something about the colonel's tone suggested that they were about to witness something extraordinary. "Her techniques have been credited with saving over 400 lives in special operations alone," Colonel Morrison continued. "Her training protocols have been adopted by every special operations medical unit in the American military and are being implemented by our NATO allies." Sullivan felt a chill run down his spine as he began to understand the scope of Dr. Bennett's impact. 400 lives was a staggering number, an entire battalion's worth of personnel who were alive because of innovations developed by the woman they had tried to turn away from the building.
But statistics, however impressive, cannot capture the true significance of her contributions, Colonel Morrison said, his voice taking on a more personal tone. Dr. Bennett didn't develop these techniques in a laboratory or simulation environment. She developed them in the field, under fire, while saving the lives of America's most elite warriors. The colonel paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the audience. When he continued, his voice carried unmistakable respect and admiration. "Ladies and gentlemen, I present Dr. Sarah Catherine Bennett, pioneer of integrated battlefield surgical protocols and holder of the Purple Heart." The last phrase hit the audience like a physical blow. A collective intake of breath swept through the room, followed by spontaneous applause that built to a thunderous crescendo. The 5 Marines sat frozen in their seats, the implications of the colonel's introduction crashing over them like a tsunami. Purple Heart. The medal is awarded to military personnel wounded or killed in action against an enemy force. Dr. Bennett wasn't just a medical innovator. She was a combat veteran who had been wounded in the line of duty. Dr. Bennett approached the podium with the same unhurried confidence the Marines had observed that morning. But now her bearing took on new significance. She wasn't nervous about speaking to this high-level audience because she had faced far more intimidating challenges under far more dangerous circumstances. "Thank you, Colonel Morrison," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the sophisticated sound system. "And thank you all for your attention this afternoon." She activated the room's holographic display system, and 3-dimensional images began materializing in the air above the audience. Anatomical models, tactical scenarios, and medical equipment that seemed to float in space with startling realism. "5 years ago," Dr. Bennett began, "I was deployed to Forward Operating Base Chapman in Afghanistan's Khost Province. I was assigned to a conventional medical unit, treating routine injuries and illnesses for a brigade of infantry soldiers." The holographic display shifted to show a detailed map of Afghanistan, with FOB Chapman highlighted in red. The base was located in one of the most contested regions of the country, where Taliban and al-Qaeda forces maintained significant influence despite years of coalition operations. "What I discovered," Dr. Bennett continued, "was that conventional trauma protocols were inadequate for the kinds of injuries being sustained in that operational environment." Rodriguez found himself leaning forward, completely absorbed in Dr. Bennett's presentation. Her clinical tone couldn't disguise the fact that she was describing personal experiences that had shaped her professional development. Traditional battlefield medicine emphasizes rapid evacuation to surgical facilities, she explained, as the holographic display showed medical evacuation helicopters and field hospitals. This approach works well when evacuation is possible within the golden hour, the critical 60-minute window for treating traumatic injuries. The display shifted to show a tactical map with helicopter routes and evacuation timelines marked in different colors. Green routes indicated successful evacuations within the golden hour, while red routes showed areas where evacuation was impossible or excessively dangerous. But in many special operations scenarios, Dr. Bennett said, evacuation within the golden hour is not possible. Teams operate in remote locations, under hostile conditions, with extraction dependent on mission completion or tactical circumstances beyond medical considerations. Mitchell's communications background helped him understand the implications of what she was describing. Special operations teams often operated in areas where calling for medical evacuation would compromise the mission and potentially endanger additional personnel. During my second deployment, Dr. Bennett continued, I was assigned to a forward surgical team supporting special operations forces in Helmand Province. It was there that I first encountered the limitations of conventional trauma protocols. The holographic display showed a three-dimensional recreation of a forward operating base, complete with landing zones, defensive positions, and medical facilities. It was a small, isolated outpost surrounded by hostile territory. On March 15, 2019, Dr. Bennett said, her voice taking on a more personal tone, a reconnaissance team was ambushed during a patrol in the Sangin district. 4 operators were critically wounded, but enemy fire prevented helicopter evacuation for over 6 hours. Brennan felt his stomach tighten as he realized that Dr. Bennett was describing a specific incident, not a hypothetical scenario, but a real operation where real people had been fighting for their lives. Using conventional protocols, Dr. Bennett explained, we would have limited our treatment to stabilization procedures, IV fluids, pressure bandages, pain management, while waiting for evacuation to a surgical facility. The holographic display showed standard field medical equipment and procedures, with clinical indicators showing patient condition deteriorating over time. But after 3 hours, Dr. Bennett said quietly, it became clear that one of the operators would not survive until evacuation was possible. He had sustained a penetrating chest wound with massive internal bleeding that couldn't be controlled through external pressure. Carter's sniper training had given him familiarity with ballistic trauma, and he understood the fatal implications of the injury Dr. Bennett was describing. Without surgical intervention, the wounded operator would bleed to death regardless of other medical treatment. So I made a decision, Dr. Bennett said, her voice steady but carrying an undertone of emotion that suggested the memory remained vivid and painful. I performed an emergency thoracotomy in the field using improvised surgical instruments and working by flashlight in a bunker while under intermittent enemy fire. The holographic display shifted to show a detailed 3-dimensional recreation of the surgical procedure, complete with anatomical models and improvised surgical instruments. The clinical precision of the display couldn't disguise the desperate, life-or-death nature of what Dr. Bennett was describing. The procedure took 43 minutes, she continued. During that time, the base received incoming mortar fire twice, and small arms fire was constant. But we were able to control the internal bleeding and stabilize the patient until helicopter evacuation became possible. Sullivan found himself holding his breath as Dr. Bennett described the outcome of her improvised surgery. The idea of performing complex medical procedures while under enemy fire was almost incomprehensible, requiring a level of focus and courage that went far beyond normal military medical training. The operator survived, Dr. Bennett said. He recovered fully and returned to active duty 6 months later. The audience remained silent, but Rodriguez could feel the weight of collective awe settling over the room. Dr. Bennett had just described performing life-saving surgery under combat conditions that would have challenged even the most experienced trauma surgeons working in fully equipped hospitals.
That incident taught me that conventional battlefield medicine was based on assumptions that didn't always hold true in special operations environments, Dr. Bennett continued. So I began developing new protocols specifically designed for austere conditions where evacuation was delayed or impossible. The holographic display shifted to show a comparison between conventional field medical kits and the advanced surgical equipment that Dr. Bennett had developed. The differences were striking. Her kit included miniaturized surgical instruments, advanced hemostatic agents, and portable monitoring equipment that could support complex procedures in field conditions. Over the next 18 months, Dr. Bennett said, I field-tested these protocols during 27 separate operations. The techniques were refined based on practical experience and operational feedback from the medics and operators who used them. Rodriguez's mind reeled as he tried to comprehend the scope of what Dr. Bennett was describing. 27 operations meant 27 separate occasions when American personnel had been wounded severely to require surgical intervention under combat conditions. The results exceeded our most optimistic projections, Dr. Bennett continued. Survival rates for critically wounded personnel increased by 37% when the new protocols were employed. More importantly, return-to-duty rates increased by 51%, meaning that operators who survived their injuries were more likely to recover fully enough to return to active service. Brennan found himself staring at Dr. Bennett with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. The statistics she was presenting represented hundreds of American lives saved and families spared the devastating loss of sons, fathers, and brothers. But the true test of these protocols, Dr. Bennett said, came during Operation Iron Thunder. The holographic display shifted to show a tactical map of a mountainous region in Afghanistan, with various military symbols indicating unit positions and movement patterns. The scale and complexity of the operation were immediately apparent. This had been a major special operations mission involving multiple units and significant tactical objectives. Iron Thunder was a joint operation targeting a high-value Taliban commander believed to be coordinating attacks against coalition forces. The mission required infiltration of a heavily defended mountain compound, followed by direct action against enemy forces and extraction under hostile conditions. Carter's special operations background helped him understand the complexity of what Dr. Bennett was describing. Mountain operations were among the most challenging military scenarios, requiring specialized equipment, extensive planning, and acceptance of significant tactical risks. I was assigned to the mission as part of the medical support element, Dr. Bennett continued. Our role was to provide immediate trauma care for casualties while the assault team secured the objective. The holographic display showed the mission timeline, with different phases marked in various colors. The insertion phase was green, indicating successful infiltration. The assault phase was yellow, indicating moderate resistance. But the extraction phase was red, indicating significant complications.
The assault proceeded according to plan for the first 40 minutes, Dr. Bennett said. The target was secured, intelligence was gathered, and the teams prepared for extraction. But as the helicopters approached the landing zone, we came under heavy fire from enemy forces that had surrounded the compound. Rodriguez felt his hands tighten on the armrests of his seat as Dr. Bennett described the tactical situation. He had been in similar circumstances during his own deployments, and he understood the terror and confusion of being trapped in hostile territory under heavy fire. The lead helicopter was hit by rocket-propelled grenade fire and crashed approximately 200 meters from the landing zone, Dr. Bennett said, her voice maintaining clinical precision despite the emotional weight of what she was describing. 7 personnel were aboard, including the mission commander and 3 members of my medical team. The holographic display showed the crash site, with medical symbols indicating the locations of wounded personnel and tactical symbols showing enemy positions surrounding the area. It was a nightmare scenario, critically wounded personnel trapped in open terrain under direct fire from multiple directions. Conventional protocols would have required us to establish a secure perimeter and wait for additional medical evacuation assets, Dr. Bennett continued. But the crash survivors included 2 operators with life-threatening injuries that required immediate surgical intervention. Mitchell's communications experience helped him understand the impossible tactical situation Dr. Bennett was describing. Establishing a secure perimeter would have required significant time and personnel, time that the wounded operators didn't have. "So, we improvised," Dr. Bennett said simply. "Using smoke grenades for concealment and suppressive fire from the remaining assault teams, I led a 3-person medical team to the crash site." The holographic display showed the movement pattern of the medical team, with red lines indicating enemy fire and green areas showing friendly suppressive fire. The route to the crash site cut directly through the most dangerous area of the battlefield. "We reached the crashed helicopter after 12 minutes of movement under fire," Dr. Bennett said. "What we found there would test every protocol and technique we had developed." The audience sat in absolute silence, completely absorbed in Dr. Bennett's account of one of the most desperate medical rescues in special operations history. Rodriguez found himself wondering how anyone could maintain the focus and skill necessary to perform surgery under such conditions. The pilot had sustained a penetrating abdominal wound with massive internal bleeding. The co-pilot had multiple fractures and a severe head injury. And the mission commander had taken shrapnel to the chest that had punctured his lung and damaged his heart. The clinical description couldn't disguise the fact that Dr. Bennett was describing 3 men who were dying in front of her, while enemy forces tried to kill everyone involved in the rescue attempt. "We had approximately 30 minutes before enemy reinforcements would make our position untenable," Dr. Bennett said. 3 critically wounded patients, limited supplies, no secure workspace, and constant enemy fire. Sullivan felt his palms sweating as he imagined the pressure Dr. Bennett must have felt in that moment. The lives of 3 American heroes depended entirely on her ability to perform under the most extreme conditions imaginable. "So we got to work," Dr. Bennett said, and for the first time a slight smile played at the corners of her mouth. Dr. Bennett paused at the podium, her hands resting lightly on the controls of the holographic display system. The room remained in absolute silence, 200 of the military's most experienced personnel hanging on every word of her account. The tactical situation she had described, 3 dying operators, limited time, constant enemy fire, represented every combat medic's worst nightmare. "The first decision was triage," Dr. Bennett continued, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of the memory. "With 3 critically wounded patients and limited time, we had to determine who could be saved and in what order." The holographic display showed medical assessment data, vital signs, injury classifications, and survival probabilities calculated in real time during the chaos of combat. The clinical precision of the data couldn't disguise the brutal calculus involved in deciding who lived and who died. "The co-pilot's head injury was beyond our field capability," Dr. Bennett said quietly. "We could stabilize him for evacuation, but definitive treatment required neurosurgical facilities that were hours away. The pilot's abdominal wound was severe but manageable with the protocols we had developed. But the mission commander?" She paused, and for the first time during the presentation, her professional composure showed a crack of emotion. "Captain David Lynch had taken shrapnel directly to the chest. The fragments had punctured his right lung and damaged the pericardium, the sac surrounding the heart. Without immediate surgical intervention, he would be dead within minutes." Rodriguez found himself leaning forward in his seat, completely absorbed in the life and death drama Dr. Bennett was describing. The technical details she provided painted a vivid picture of the desperate medical emergency unfolding in the middle of a firefight. "So we made our choice," Dr. Bennett said. "We would attempt field surgery on Captain Lynch, while my medical team worked to stabilize the other 2 casualties for evacuation." The holographic display showed the improvised surgical setup, equipment cases arranged to create a sterile workspace, portable lighting systems powered by battery packs, and medical instruments designed for field use rather than hospital conditions. "The challenge wasn't just medical," Dr. Bennett explained. "We were working in an active combat zone, with enemy forces attempting to advance on our position. Every few minutes, incoming fire would force us to take cover, interrupting the surgical procedure. Brennan tried to imagine performing delicate surgery while bullets flew overhead and explosions shook the ground. The level of focus and courage required seemed almost superhuman. We began the thoracotomy at 1:34:07 hours, Dr. Bennett said, consulting notes that appeared on the holographic display. The initial incision revealed massive internal bleeding and significant tissue damage from the shrapnel fragments. Mitchell watched the holographic reconstruction of the surgical procedure, amazed by the precision and complexity of what Dr. Bennett was describing. The three-dimensional anatomical models showed exactly where the shrapnel had penetrated and the path of internal damage it had caused. The first priority was controlling the bleeding, Dr. Bennett continued. Using hemostatic agents and pressure techniques, we were able to reduce blood loss by approximately 60% within the first 10 minutes. Carter noted the clinical precision of Dr. Bennett's account, but he could also see the human cost reflected in her expression. Behind every statistic and percentage was a man fighting for his life while his teammates fought to protect the medical team trying to save him. At 13:55 hours, enemy forces began a coordinated assault on our position, Dr. Bennett said, her voice taking on a harder edge. Small arms fire was coming from 3 directions, and we began receiving mortar fire from positions approximately 800 meters to the north. The holographic display showed the tactical situation from above. Enemy positions marked in red, friendly positions in blue, and the crash site marked with a medical cross in the center of the combat zone. The assault team leader, Master Sergeant Williams, approached our position and informed me that we had approximately 15 minutes before our position would be overrun, Dr. Bennett continued. He recommended that we abandon the surgical procedure and evacuate immediately. Sullivan felt his stomach clench as he realized the impossible choice Dr. Bennett had faced. Abandoning the surgery meant certain death for Captain Lynch, but continuing meant risking the lives of everyone involved in the rescue operation. I informed Master Sergeant Williams that we needed at least 20 more minutes to complete the procedure, Dr. Bennett said. He told me that 20 minutes was impossible. We would all be dead in 15. The room remained silent, but Rodriguez could feel the collective tension as the audience waited to learn what decision Dr. Bennett had made in that impossible moment. That's when Master Sergeant Williams asked me a question that changed everything, Dr. Bennett said, her voice becoming quieter but somehow more intense. He asked me if I was certain that Captain Lynch would survive if we completed the surgery. The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone in the audience to consider what they would have done in Dr. Bennett's position. Medical professionals were trained to provide the best possible care to every patient, but military personnel were trained to make tactical decisions based on the greatest good for the greatest number. I told him that I couldn't guarantee survival, Dr. Bennett admitted. Surgery under field conditions carries significant risks even under ideal circumstances, but I could guarantee that Captain Lynch would die if we abandoned the procedure. Brennan found himself holding his breath as Dr. Bennett described the moment when medical tactics and medical ethics collided in the most dramatic possible circumstances. Master Sergeant Williams looked at Captain Lynch, looked at me, and looked at his remaining operators, Dr. Bennett continued. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Doc, if you think you can save him, we'll hold this position until you're finished." The simple statement carried enormous weight. Williams was essentially committing his remaining personnel to a fight they probably couldn't win, accepting casualties among his healthy operators to give one wounded man a chance at survival. "So we continued the surgery," Dr. Bennett said, and Master Sergeant Williams deployed his remaining operators in a defensive perimeter around our position. The holographic display showed the defensive positions, with each operator marked by name and weapon system. It was a pitifully small force to hold off the enemy assault that was coming, but they had committed themselves to protecting the medical team regardless of the cost. At 14:42 hours, the enemy assault began in earnest, Dr. Bennett said. Heavy machine gun fire, rocket-propelled grenades, and coordinated small arms fire from multiple directions. Carter's special operations experience helped him understand the tactical situation Dr. Bennett was describing. The defensive perimeter was too small and too lightly manned to hold off a determined assault for any significant period. "But we continued operating," Dr. Bennett said, her voice taking on an almost serene quality. Sergeant Martinez, my senior medic, continued monitoring Captain Lynch's vital signs. Corporal Jackson maintained the portable lighting system, and I continued the thoracotomy. The clinical description couldn't capture the surreal nature of what Dr. Bennett was describing. Performing delicate heart surgery while a battle raged around them, trusting in the skill and courage of the operators protecting them. At 14:07 hours, a rocket-propelled grenade struck the wreckage of the helicopter approximately 15 feet from our position, Dr. Bennett continued. The explosion threw shrapnel in all directions and temporarily blinded everyone with dust and debris. Rodriguez winced as he imagined the chaos and terror of that moment. An RPG explosion at close range would have been deafening, disorienting, and potentially fatal to anyone caught in the open. "When the dust cleared," Dr. Bennett said quietly, "I discovered that a piece of shrapnel from the RPG had struck me in the back, penetrating between my shoulder blades and lodging against my spine." The revelation hit the audience like a physical blow. Dr. Bennett had been wounded while performing surgery on another wounded operator, yet she had somehow continued the procedure. "The shrapnel had missed my spinal cord by approximately 3 millimeters," Dr. Bennett continued, "but it had severed several muscle groups and caused significant bleeding." Mitchell stared at Dr. Bennett in amazement, trying to comprehend the level of physical pain and shock she must have experienced while continuing to operate on Captain Lynch. Sergeant Martinez immediately began treating my wound while I continued the thoracotomy. He applied pressure dressings and administered pain medication, but removal of the shrapnel would require surgical facilities that weren't available in the field. The holographic display showed a medical cross-section of Dr. Bennett's back, with the shrapnel fragment highlighted in red and the surrounding tissue damage marked in yellow. The proximity to her spinal cord was terrifyingly close. At 14:12 hours, Master Sergeant Williams reported that his perimeter was about to be breached. Enemy forces had advanced to within 50 meters of our position, and his operators were running low on ammunition. Sullivan felt his heart racing as Dr. Bennett described the final moments of the desperate surgery. Enemy forces closing in, ammunition running low, and 2 wounded people trying to save a third while fighting for their own lives. "That's when I made the most important decision of my medical career," Dr. Bennett said, her voice taking on a tone of absolute certainty. "I chose to complete the surgery." The simple statement carried enormous weight. Dr. Bennett had chosen to continue operating despite her own wounds, despite the approaching enemy forces, despite the probability that they would all be killed before the procedure could be completed. The final step was repairing the damage to Captain Lynch's pericardium, Dr. Bennett explained, using microsurgical techniques and working by flashlight because our portable lighting had been damaged in the RPG explosion. Brennan watched the holographic reconstruction of the final surgical steps, amazed by the precision required to repair heart tissue under any circumstances, much less while wounded and under fire. At 14:18 hours, exactly 31 minutes after we began the procedure, I completed the thoracotomy, Dr. Bennett said. Captain Lynch's vital signs stabilized, and we began preparing him for evacuation. Carter found himself exhaling slowly, not realizing he had been holding his breath during Dr. Bennett's description of the surgery's completion. But our ordeal wasn't over, Dr. Bennett continued. Enemy forces had breached the perimeter in 2 locations, and Master Sergeant Williams was down to his last magazine of ammunition. The tactical situation had become hopeless. Even with the surgery completed, there was no way to evacuate the wounded personnel before enemy forces overran their position. That's when we heard the most beautiful sound in the world, Dr. Bennett said, a slight smile appearing on her face for the first time during the presentation. The rotor noise of incoming helicopters. Rodriguez felt a surge of relief as Dr. Bennett described the arrival of the evacuation aircraft. After 31 minutes of desperate surgery under fire, help was finally arriving.
The holographic display showed the aerial support arriving, with the attack helicopters marked in blue and their weapons systems engaging enemy positions marked in red. The evacuation took 7 minutes, Dr. Bennett continued. We loaded Captain Lynch, the pilot, the co-pilot, and the wounded members of Master Sergeant Williams' team onto the helicopter. Mitchell watched the holographic recreation of the evacuation, noting the efficiency and speed with which the medical team had moved their patients from the crash site to the evacuation aircraft. As we lifted off, Dr. Bennett said, I looked back at the battlefield where we had just spent the most intense hour of my life. The wreckage of the crashed helicopter was burning, the ground was scarred with bullet holes and explosion craters, and smoke was rising from enemy positions that had been engaged by the Apache helicopters. The image Dr. Bennett painted was both devastating and triumphant, a battlefield where American heroes had fought desperately to save their comrades, accepting enormous risks to uphold the military's commitment to leave no one behind. The flight to the surgical hospital took 43 minutes, Dr. Bennett continued. During that time, Captain Lynch remained stable, his vital signs strong enough to suggest that the field surgery had been successful. Sullivan found himself wondering about the outcome of Dr. Bennett's heroic efforts. Had Captain Lynch survived? Had the desperate surgery performed under impossible conditions actually saved his life? Captain Lynch underwent additional surgery at the hospital to repair damage that couldn't be addressed in the field, Dr. Bennett said. But the thoracotomy we performed at the crash site had stabilized his condition enough to allow for successful definitive treatment. The room remained silent, but Rodriguez could feel the collective admiration and respect radiating from the audience. Dr. Bennett had described one of the most heroic medical rescues in military history. Captain Lynch recovered fully and returned to active duty 6 months later, Dr. Bennett said, her voice carrying obvious satisfaction. He now serves as a training officer at the Special Operations Command, where he helps prepare the next generation of operators for the challenges they'll face in combat. Brennan felt a surge of emotion as Dr. Bennett described the successful outcome of her desperate surgery. The man whose life she had saved under impossible conditions had not only survived but had returned to serve his country in a new capacity. The pilot and co-pilot also survived their injuries, Dr. Bennett continued. The pilot returned to flight status after 8 months of recovery, and the co-pilot was medically retired but continues to serve as a civilian contractor supporting special operations training. The successful outcomes validated everything Dr. Bennett had risked during that desperate hour at the crash site. Her decision to continue the surgery despite her own wounds and the tactical situation had saved 3 American lives. As for Master Sergeant Williams and his operators, Dr. Bennett said, they all survived the engagement. Master Sergeant Williams was awarded the Silver Star for his leadership during the rescue operation, and each of his operators received the Bronze Star for valor. Carter noted that Dr. Bennett mentioned the awards given to the operators who had protected her during the surgery, but she hadn't mentioned any awards given to her for performing the surgery itself. The shrapnel fragment lodged against my spine was successfully removed during surgery at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany, Dr. Bennett continued. Recovery took 4 months, after which I was cleared to return to active duty. Mitchell realized that Dr. Bennett was describing her own medical treatment with the same clinical precision she had used to treat Captain Lynch. Even her own life-threatening injury was discussed as simply another medical case to be resolved. Upon my return to active duty, Dr. Bennett said, I was assigned to Task Force Ranger to further develop and refine the field surgical protocols that had proven successful during Operation Iron Thunder. The assignment to Task Force Ranger represented recognition of Dr. Bennett's exceptional capabilities and the value of the innovations she had developed. It was also confirmation that her heroic actions had been officially recognized at the highest levels of military leadership. And that, Dr. Bennett concluded, is how I learned that the human capacity for performance under extreme stress exceeds anything we might imagine under normal circumstances. The presentation had taken exactly 47 minutes, during which Dr. Bennett had held the complete attention of 200 of the military's most experienced personnel. Her account of Operation Iron Thunder had been both technically precise and emotionally powerful, demonstrating the practical application of her medical innovations while revealing the extraordinary courage and dedication that had made those innovations possible. As Dr. Bennett stepped away from the podium, the audience rose in spontaneous applause that built to a thunderous ovation. Officers, enlisted personnel, and civilian contractors alike stood to honor a woman who had redefined what was possible in battlefield medicine.
Rodriguez found himself clapping with tears in his eyes, thinking about the woman he and his fellow Marines had tried to turn away from the building that morning. They had seen a petite civilian who didn't belong in their world of warriors and combat veterans. They had completely failed to recognize one of the most heroic figures in modern military medicine. The applause continued for nearly 3 minutes, a sustained ovation that spoke to the profound impact of Dr. Bennett's presentation. As the sound gradually subsided and the audience returned to their seats, Dr. Bennett remained at the podium, preparing to field questions from what she knew would be an intensely curious and professionally engaged audience. The first hand to rise belonged to a British SAS colonel whose weathered face bore the scars of multiple deployments. "Dr. Bennett," he said in a crisp English accent, "your presentation focused on the technical aspects of field surgery, but I'm curious about the psychological preparation required for such procedures. How does one train for operating while wounded and under fire?" Dr. Bennett considered the question carefully before responding. "Colonel, I think the honest answer is that you can't fully prepare for those circumstances through training alone. What you can do is develop absolute confidence in your technical skills during peacetime, so that when extreme stress occurs, the procedures become automatic rather than conscious decisions." A Navy SEAL commander raised his hand next. "Ma'am, you mentioned that your protocols have been adopted by NATO allies. Can you elaborate on the international implementation of these techniques?" "Certainly," Dr. Bennett replied. "We've conducted training programs with medical personnel from 12 allied nations, including specialized courses at the NATO Special Operations Medical Training Center in Belgium. The protocols have been adapted for different equipment sets and operational requirements, but the core principles remain consistent." Rodriguez watched Dr. Bennett field questions with the same calm competence she had displayed during her presentation. Every response demonstrated deep expertise combined with practical experience that commanded respect from even the most senior officers in the audience. A German KSK surgeon raised his hand. "Dr. Bennett, your innovations clearly save lives, but they also require medics to accept significantly increased personal risk. How do you address the ethical implications of asking medical personnel to operate in such dangerous conditions?" The question touched on one of the most complex aspects of Dr. Bennett's work, the tension between medical ethics and military necessity. Her response was measured and thoughtful. "That's an excellent question, and one that keeps me awake at night," she admitted. "Medical personnel are non-combatants under international law, but when you embed with special operations forces, that protection becomes largely theoretical. The ethical framework I use is simple. If my actions can save lives that would otherwise be lost, then the increased risk is justified." Carter found himself nodding in agreement with Dr. Bennett's ethical reasoning. It reflected the same kind of moral clarity that drove special operations personnel to accept dangerous missions in service of larger objectives. An Air Force pararescue officer stood to ask the next question. "Dr. Bennett, you've described developing these protocols during deployments, but how do you test and refine surgical techniques in combat zones without putting patients at unnecessary risk?" "Initially, we only attempted the advanced procedures when conventional treatment had failed or was clearly inadequate. As our confidence and success rates improved, we began applying the techniques earlier in the treatment process. But every decision was based on the principle that we would never attempt a field procedure unless the alternative was certain death." Mitchell appreciated the careful methodology Dr. Bennett described. She hadn't recklessly experimented with innovative techniques. She had systematically developed and tested them under controlled conditions before applying them in life-or-death situations.
The questions continued for another 20 minutes, covering technical details, training requirements, equipment specifications, and implementation challenges. Dr. Bennett answered each inquiry with authority and precision, demonstrating mastery of every aspect of her field. Finally, Colonel Morrison returned to the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we can all agree that Dr. Bennett has provided us with invaluable insights into the future of battlefield medicine. Please join me in thanking her for an outstanding presentation. The audience rose for another sustained ovation as Dr. Bennett gathered her materials and stepped away from the podium. As the crowd began to disperse, small groups formed around her, officers and medical personnel eager to continue discussions about specific aspects of her work. The 5 Marines remained in their seats, each processing what they had witnessed during the presentation. The woman they had dismissed as a misplaced civilian that morning had revealed herself to be one of the most decorated and innovative medical officers in the military. "I feel like we owe her an apology," Sullivan said quietly, his young face reflecting genuine embarrassment about their earlier assumptions. "We owe her more than an apology," Rodriguez replied. "We owe her our respect and probably our gratitude. People like her are the reason guys like us come home alive." Brennan shook his head slowly, still struggling to reconcile Dr. Bennett's slight physical presence with the extraordinary courage and capability she had demonstrated. How do you judge someone like that by their appearance? She's maybe 5'4" and 115 pounds, but she's tougher than any of us.
Tougher isn't the right word, Carter observed, his sniper training having taught him to make precise distinctions. She's not physically tougher, she's mentally tougher. The kind of focus and determination it takes to perform surgery while wounded and under fire, that's not physical strength, that's something else entirely. Mitchell nodded in agreement. It's the same quality you see in the best special operations personnel. The ability to function at peak performance regardless of external circumstances. As the crowd around Dr. Bennett began to thin, Rodriguez made a decision that surprised even himself. "Come on," he said to his fellow Marines. "We need to talk to her." The 5 Marines approached Dr. Bennett as she finished her conversation with a group of international medical officers. When she noticed their approach, she turned toward them with the same patient expression she had worn during their morning encounter. "Staff Sergeant Rodriguez," she said, recognizing him immediately. "I trust the presentation answered some of your questions about my qualifications." Rodriguez felt heat rise in his cheeks as he remembered their earlier skepticism about her presence at the symposium. "Dr. Bennett, I want to apologize for our behavior this morning. We made assumptions based on visual assessment and limited information," Dr. Bennett interrupted gently. "It's exactly what I would expect from competent Marines. No apology necessary." Brennan stepped forward, his massive frame somehow seeming less intimidating in Dr. Bennett's presence. "Ma'am, can I ask you something? When that RPG went off and you got hit with shrapnel, how did you keep operating? The pain alone should have been incapacitating." Dr. Bennett's expression became thoughtful, as if she were trying to explain something that defied easy description. "Corporal, when someone's life depends entirely on your actions, pain becomes irrelevant. It's not that you don't feel it, it's that you can't afford to let it matter." "Is that something you learned or something you just had?" Carter asked, genuinely curious about the psychological mechanisms that had enabled Dr. Bennett's extraordinary performance. "Both," Dr. Bennett replied. "Medical training teaches you to function under pressure, and military training teaches you to function despite physical discomfort. But there's something else that happens when you're in that situation, a kind of clarity that comes from knowing exactly what needs to be done." Sullivan, emboldened by Dr. Bennett's patient answers to his colleagues' questions, asked something that had been bothering him since the presentation. "Dr. Bennett, why didn't you mention your Purple Heart during our conversation this morning? You could have ended our questions immediately." Dr. Bennett smiled, and for the first time, the expression seemed completely unguarded. "Private First Class, the Purple Heart represents the worst day of my life, not the best. It's a reminder of pain and fear and the possibility that I might have failed to save Captain Lynch. I don't lead with it because it's not what defines me as a medical officer." Mitchell found Dr. Bennett's response both humble and profound.
She viewed her most dramatic achievement not as a source of pride, but as a reminder of the human cost of combat and the responsibility she carried as a medical professional. "What defines you as a medical officer?" Rodriguez asked, genuinely curious about how Dr. Bennett saw herself and her role. "The same thing that defines any good military medical officer," she replied. "The commitment to bring everyone home alive regardless of the circumstances or the personal cost." The simple statement encapsulated everything the Marines had learned about Dr. Bennett during their brief encounters. She wasn't seeking recognition or glory. She was simply fulfilling the most fundamental obligation of military medicine. "Dr. Bennett," Carter said, "when you were developing these surgical protocols, did you know they would become as influential as they have?" "Not at all," Dr. Bennett admitted. "I was just trying to solve immediate problems with the tools and knowledge available. The fact that the solutions have broader applications was a pleasant surprise." Brennan gestured toward the departing audience members, many of whom were still discussing aspects of Dr. Bennett's presentation. "Ma'am, you've influenced medical training across the entire military. That has to feel pretty significant." Dr. Bennett followed his gaze, watching as groups of officers continued their discussions about battlefield medicine innovations. "What feels significant," she said quietly, "is knowing that medics in the field have better tools and techniques for saving lives. The recognition is nice, but the impact is what matters." Rodriguez realized that Dr. Bennett's attitude reflected the best qualities of military service: focus on mission accomplishment rather than personal recognition, commitment to continuous improvement, and acceptance of personal risk in service of larger objectives. "Dr. Bennett," he said, "I want to thank you for taking the time to answer our questions, both this morning and now. You've taught us something important about making assumptions and about what real courage looks like."
Staff Sergeant, you've all demonstrated real courage in your own deployments and operations, Dr. Bennett replied. "What I do is just a different application of the same principles: training, dedication, and commitment to the mission." Mitchell shook his head. "Ma'am, with respect, what you did during Operation Iron Thunder goes beyond normal military courage. Performing surgery while wounded and under fire, that's extraordinary by any standard." Dr. Bennett was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "Sergeant, extraordinary circumstances reveal what we're truly capable of achieving. Every one of you has faced moments that demanded more than you thought you could give. The only difference is that my moments happen to be captured in official reports." Sullivan found Dr. Bennett's modesty both inspiring and humbling. She refused to see herself as exceptional, despite having performed one of the most heroic acts in recent military history. "Dr. Bennett," he said, "thank you for what you do. People like us depend on people like you to bring us home when things go wrong." Dr. Bennett's expression softened, and she reached out to shake hands with each of the 5 Marines. "Private First Class, people like me depend on people like you to create the conditions that make our work possible. It's all part of the same mission." As the Marines walked away from their conversation with Dr. Bennett, each carried with him a new understanding of courage, dedication, and the true meaning of military service. They had begun the day thinking they knew what a warrior looked like, and they had ended it learning that the most profound strength often comes in the most unexpected packages. Rodriguez paused at the building's exit and looked back toward the briefing room where Dr. Bennett was gathering her equipment. That morning, he and his fellow Marines had seen a petite civilian who didn't belong in their world of military professionals. Now he saw something entirely different: a hero whose quiet strength and unwavering dedication represented the very best of military service. The scar on her shoulder blade, barely visible beneath her tank top, wasn't just a reminder of her Purple Heart. It was a symbol of the sacrifice and courage that defined the true warriors among them, those who measured their success not by the recognition they received, but by the lives they saved and the service they provided to others. As the 5 Marines walked across the Nevada desert toward their quarters, each knew that they would never again make the mistake of judging someone's capabilities by their appearance.
Dr. Sarah Bennett had taught them that the most important battles are often fought by the most unlikely heroes, and that true strength comes not from physical presence, but from the courage to act when everything depends on it. As the 5 Marines walked across the Nevada desert toward their quarters, each knew that they would never again make the mistake of judging someone's capabilities by their appearance. Dr. Sarah Bennett had taught them that the most important battles are often fought by the most unlikely heroes, and that true strength comes not from physical presence, but from the courage to act when everything depends on it.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.